The wind whispers across the open plains, carrying the scent of dust and adventure. The sky, a vast expanse of deepening blue, stretches endlessly above, dotted with the first hints of starlight. In the distance, a lone rider pushes forward, his silhouette dark against the fading sun. His name is Caleb Carter, a man with a past he can't outrun and a future that remains uncertain. As the town of Willow Creek appears on the horizon, Caleb slows his horse, taking in the quiet streets and the warm glow of lanterns in the windows. It's been years since he set foot here, and every building, every shadow, feels like a ghost from another life. He was once a different man in this town, before the betrayal, before the bloodshed, before he became the outlaw everyone whispers about. Inside the modest saloon at the heart of town, Evelyn Moore wipes down the worn wooden bar, her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She has learned to be tough, to carry the weight of survival on her own. But when she looks up and sees the familiar figure standing in the doorway, her breath catches. Caleb, the name she hasn't spoken in years. The man she swore she would never forgive. The air is thick with unspoken words as their eyes meet. Caleb steps forward, removing his hat as if to soften the impact of his presence. Eve, he says, his voice low, careful. She doesn't reply, just grips the edge of the bar a little tighter, as if steadying herself against a storm only she can feel. But the storm isn't just between them. Outside, beyond the peaceful glow of lanterns and laughter, danger is brewing. A gang rides under the cover of darkness, their intentions far from good. Their leader, a ruthless man named Silas Graves, has his eyes set on Willow Creek, and he's looking for someone, a man who once left him for dead. Caleb knows he doesn't have much time. He came back for one reason, to right his wrongs, to find redemption, if such a thing is even possible. But looking at Evelyn, he realizes it's more than just unfinished business with old enemies. It's about her. It's about what they lost. A gust of wind rattles the windows, and Evelyn finally speaks, her voice steady but cold. You shouldn't have come back. Caleb takes a slow breath, weighing his words carefully. I had to. The silence stretches between them, filled with years of hurt and things left unsaid. But outside, the night is no longer still. Hoofbeats echo in the distance, getting closer. The past is coming for Caleb, and this time there's nowhere left to run. This is Bright Sky Asterisk, a story of love, redemption, and the fight to reclaim what was lost. The past and present collide in a town on the brink of chaos, where every choice comes at a price. As the clock ticks down to the inevitable showdown, one question remains: can Caleb finally escape the darkness that haunts him, or will it consume everything he holds dear? Find out when Bright Sky Asterisk releases on February 7th. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. The silence between Caleb and Evelyn stretched, thick with years of unspoken words. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden walls of the saloon, rattling the doors as if warning them of the storm brewing beyond the hills. Caleb could feel the weight of Evelyn's stare, the quiet anger just beneath the surface. He knew this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the way her eyes cut through him like a blade. I had to come back, he said again, softer this time, as if saying it differently might change the way she looked at him. Evelyn let out a quiet laugh, but there was no warmth in it. You think you can just walk in here after all these years, say a few words, and expect things to be different? She shook her head, stepping around the bar, her arms folded tightly across her chest. People don't forget, Caleb. I don't forget. He lowered his gaze, knowing she had every right to be angry. He had left without a word, vanished into the night, and by the time she heard his name again, it was attached to wanted posters nailed to trees and saloon doors. Outlaw, thief, Murderer. The stories traveled faster than he ever could, each one painting a darker picture than the last. But Evelyn didn't need stories. She knew the truth. She had loved him once, and love never lets you forget. Caleb took a slow breath, steadying himself. I know I can't change the past. But I didn't come back for forgiveness, Eve. I came back to make things right. Evelyn scoffed. Make things right. Her voice carried something dangerously close to hurt. With who? The people in this town who spit at the mention of your name. The sheriff who'd hang you the second he saw you. She stepped closer, searching his face for an answer. Or is this about Silas Graves? The name landed heavy between them, a shadow that stretched long and dark over both their lives. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had spent years trying to outrun the past, but no matter how far he rode, some ghosts refused to be buried. Silas Graves was one of them. He's coming, isn't he? Evelyn's voice was quieter now, more knowing than accusatory. Caleb nodded once. I can't let him take this town. Evelyn shook her head, exhaling sharply. And you think you alone can stop him? Before Caleb could answer, the saloon doors creaked open, and an older man stepped inside. His boots were worn from years on the trail, his gray beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Marshal Tom Whiteacre. The room tensed at his presence. Conversation stemmed, and a few of the men at the tables shifted uncomfortably. The marshal wasn't one for pleasantries, especially not with men like Caleb Carter. He looked straight at him. Didn't think I'd see you in this town again. Caleb didn't move. Didn't think I'd be back. Tom studied him, his expression unreadable. You got any idea the kind of trouble you bring just by standing here? I do, Caleb admitted. The marshal's eyes flicked at Evelyn, as if checking to see if she was all right. Then back to Caleb. Sheriff'll be back by morning. If you're smart, you'll be gone before then. Caleb didn't argue. He understood the way things worked. There was no place in this town for a man with a bounty on his head. But still, he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Tom sighed, then leaned against the bar. Rumors are spreading. A gang was spotted a few miles outside of town. Rode in from the north, fast and quiet. Not making a move yet, but that don't mean they won't. Caleb already knew who they were, Silas. Tom gave a slow nod. If he's looking for you, he won't stop till he finds you. And he won't care who gets in his way. Evelyn crossed her arms, her expression hardening. And what's your plan, Tom? Sit back and let him take what he wants. Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. My plan is to keep this town from turning into a graveyard. That starts with making sure you don't bring the fight straight to our doorstep. He looked back at Caleb. You got history with him. That makes this personal, which means it's even more dangerous. Caleb knew he was right. Silas Graves wasn't the kind of man who fought fair. He didn't care about law, didn't care about mercy. He only cared about revenge. And if he had tracked Caleb this far, it meant he wasn't coming alone. Tom straightened, his tone leaving no room for debate. Whatever you're planning, Carter, you better figure it out quick. Because when they come, they won't be knocking. With that, the marshal turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Evelyn exhaled and turned to Caleb, her voice lower now. You should go. You know he's right. Caleb ran a hand over his face, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He could leave. He could ride out before sunrise and disappear into the night like he had before. Maybe he could even buy himself a few more years before the past caught up to him again. But as he looked at Evelyn, at the town that had once been his home, he knew the truth. He wasn't running this time. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats. Faint, but coming closer. The sound of distant hoofbeats faded into the night, but the weight of their meaning lingered in the air. Caleb could feel it in his bones. Silas was coming, and when he did, he wouldn't be alone. Evelyn turned away, grabbing a half-empty bottle from the shelf behind the bar and pouring herself a drink. She didn't offer one to Caleb. He didn't expect her to. Instead, she downed a quick sip before setting the glass down with more force than necessary. "You should have just stayed gone," she muttered, not looking at him. Caleb leaned against the bar, his voice steady. "If I had, this town wouldn't stand a chance." She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "You really think you're its savior? That people are just gonna forget who you are, what you've done?" Her eyes met his again, but this time there was something else in them, something closer to fear. "You think they won't turn you over to save their own skin?" Caleb didn't answer. He knew she wasn't wrong. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place to take risks, not when survival depended on keeping your head down and your doors locked. But he also knew that fear wouldn't stop Silas Graves. The only thing that ever had was Caleb himself. The door creaked open again, and both of them turned as a wiry young man stepped inside. Dust covered his boots and the edges of his worn jacket, and his dark eyes darted around the saloon before settling on Caleb. "I saw him," the boy said, out of breath. "Silas and his men. They're camped just outside the old mill." Caleb nodded slowly. "How many?" The boy hesitated. "More than I could count." Evelyn let out a quiet curse under her breath, pacing behind the bar. Caleb didn't move, just let the words settle in his mind. It was what he expected. Silas never did anything small. The boy shifted on his feet, glancing between them. "Sheriff's still out at the river settlement. He won't be back till morning. If they come before then." Caleb already knew how that sentence ended. The town had no law to protect it tonight. Tom Whitaker had been right. Caleb was a problem, but he was also the only thing standing between Willow Creek and the kind of destruction it wasn't built to survive. He turned back to the boy. "Go home, Jesse. Lock your doors. Keep your head down." Jess hesitated. "What are you gonna do?" Caleb slid a glance toward Evelyn, then back at the boy. "What I have to." Jess nodded, then slipped back out into the night, vanishing as quickly as he had come. The saloon door creaked shut behind him, leaving Caleb and Evelyn alone again in the dim lantern glow. Evelyn's voice was quieter when she spoke. "If you fight him, he won't just come after you. He'll come after this town." Caleb turned to her. "He already is." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "Then don't give him a reason." Caleb exhaled, resting his hands against the bar. He wished it were that simple. He wished he could walk away and pretend none of this mattered. But it did, more than anything. Before he could say another word, the door swung open again. And this time, it wasn't a boy covered in dust. It was Tom Whitaker. His face was grim, his stance tense, and Caleb knew before the marshal even spoke that something had changed. "They're moving," Tom said, his voice low. "Not waiting till morning." Evelyn went still. Caleb straightened. Tom stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Caleb's. "You want to help this town. Then we need to move. Now." The wind outside carried a warning, rustling through the streets, shaking loose shutters, and sending dust swirling through the lantern-lit roads. The night was no longer quiet. The fight had already begun. The night felt heavier now, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of what was coming. Caleb stepped away from the bar, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He had seen Silas Graves at his worst, and if he was moving sooner than expected, it meant he had already decided how this was going to end. Tom didn't waste time. We need to get ahead of them. If they hit the town before we're ready, it's over. Evelyn's expression tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and grabbed the rifle from behind the bar, checking the chamber with the ease of someone who had learned long ago not to rely on anyone else for protection. Caleb watched her for a moment. He had always known she was strong, but seeing her now, standing in the flickering lamplight with that look of quiet determination, reminded him of why he had once loved her, and why he still did. Tom nodded toward the door. "Let's go." They stepped out into the street, where the town lay in uneasy silence. The usual sounds of laughter and conversation from the saloon and boarding house were gone, replaced by the hush of people locking their doors, pulling curtains closed, whispering prayers into the darkness. They had all heard the rumors. They all knew what was coming. Caleb and Tom moved quickly, cutting through the alleys and back roads toward the old mill, where Jesse had spotted the gang earlier. The wind stirred dust in their path, carrying the distant howl of coyotes and the faintest echo of hoofbeats, closer now. Tom gave Caleb a sharp look. "You sure about this?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." They reached the edge of town, crouching low behind an abandoned wagon near the mill. The land beyond stretched out in rolling hills, moonlight casting long shadows over the dry earth. And there, just beyond the tree line, they saw them. Silas Graves and his men. They were still, their horses barely moving, waiting in the darkness like wolves before the kill. Caleb could make out Silas's form at the front, sitting tall in the saddle, his face unreadable in the dim light. But Caleb didn't need to see his eyes to know what was in them. Tom muttered under his breath, "They're waiting for something." Caleb kept his gaze locked on Silas. As if on cue, Silas shifted in his saddle and raised a hand. His men responded instantly, adjusting their positions, gripping their weapons tighter. Then Silas spoke, his voice carrying through the still night. "Caleb Carter." Caleb didn't move. Silas let out a slow breath, almost amused. "I know you're out there." He tilted his head slightly. "You always were one to run toward trouble." Caleb glanced at Tom, then stood, stepping out from behind the wagon. He heard Tom curse under his breath, but he didn't stop him. Silas smiled. "There you are." Caleb took a few steps forward, stopping just outside the mill's shadow. "You're a long way from home, Silas." Silas shrugged. "I go where unfinished business takes me." Caleb kept his stance easy, but every muscle in his body was tense, ready. "This town doesn't have anything for you." Silas smirked. "That's where you're wrong." He leaned forward slightly. "It has you." The words settled like a weight between them. Caleb knew what was coming, knew there was no way to stop it now. Silas's voice lowered, almost thoughtful. "You know, I spend a long time thinking about this moment, wondering how it'd go." His fingers tapped idly against the reins. "Didn't figure you'd come back here to die." Caleb's voice was steady. "Then you never knew me as well as you thought." Silas's smile faded. "I know you well enough." He gestured slightly, and his men stirred, their movements slow but deliberate. Tom tensed beside Caleb, his hand hovering near his holster. Silas exhaled. "Let's not waste time, Caleb." He nodded toward the town. "You come with me, and I let them be." Caleb didn't believe that for a second. He glanced back toward the town, knowing that Evelyn was still there, knowing that people were waiting behind locked doors, hoping this would end before it began. And he knew it wouldn't. He looked back at Silas. Not gonna happen. Silas sighed, shaking his head. Shame. Then, without another word, he raised his hand, and the first shot rang out. The gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the open land like a thunderclap. Caleb dropped low, instinct taking over as he dove behind the abandoned wagon. Tom was already moving, drawing his revolver and firing off a shot toward the tree line. The moment had exploded into chaos, the stillness of the night replaced by the deafening crack of bullets and the frantic movement of men and horses. Silas's gang spread out, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Caleb saw the flicker of a muzzle flash to his right and returned fire, forcing them to scatter. Dust kicked up around him as a bullet struck the ground just inches from his boot. He couldn't stay here. He glanced at Tom, who nodded toward the saloon in the distance. They needed to fall back, regroup before the fight swallowed them whole. Caleb turned, ready to move, but then something stopped him. A sound, faint but distinct, cut through the chaos. A whistle, not just any whistle. A signal. And then he saw them. Coming from the other side of town, moving like ghosts through the dark, another group of riders approached. But these weren't Silas's men. Their movements were too coordinated, their approach too calculated. Caleb's stomach dropped as realization hit him hard. Silas wasn't alone in this. Tom saw them too. Hell, he muttered, ducking lower behind cover. Who the hell are they? Caleb clenched his jaw. Reinforcements. It made sense now. Silas had never intended for this to be a fair fight. He had always been patient, always one step ahead. He had planned for resistance, and now, with a second wave closing in, the town didn't stand a chance. A shot hit the wagon just above Caleb's head, sending splinters of wood raining down. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Tom cursed again. We gotta warn the town. Caleb already knew that, but something in him hesitated. If they ran now, if they fell back, Silas would take the streets without resistance. And once he had control, there'd be no stopping him. He was being pulled back into it. He had told himself he was making progress, but was he really? Or had he just been waiting for the next thing to prove his worth? The breaking point came when he was sitting across from his best friend, Noah, the one person who had seen him through all the phases of his life. Noah was different from the rest. He didn't care about status or success. He cared about truth. So are you doing it? Noah asked, watching Jake closely. I don't know, Jake admitted. It's a huge opportunity. It could change everything. Noah didn't react the way others had. He didn't cheer or congratulate him. Instead, he leaned forward and asked one simple question. But will it change you? Jake felt his stomach drop. He had spent so much time thinking about how this opportunity would change his career, his reputation, his future. But he hadn't thought about what it would do to him. Would it pull him back into the life he had been trying to escape? Would it make him forget the lessons he had learned? Would it make him lose himself all over again? The realization hit hard. This wasn't just a decision about a job or a project. This was a decision about who he was becoming. And if he wasn't careful, he was about to trade his newfound clarity for the same old cycle he had been trying to break free from. But the hardest part wasn't realizing the truth, it was acting on it. Because saying no meant disappointing people. It meant losing connections, burning bridges, and walking away from something that looked perfect on the surface. It meant accepting that success wasn't about impressing others. It was about being at peace with yourself. And peace doesn't come from chasing what isn't meant for you. Jake took a deep breath, staring at the message on his phone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. His heart pounded. And then finally, he made his choice. But just as he thought the hardest part was over, life threw him one final curveball, one that would test him in ways he never saw coming. Because sometimes the biggest challenges aren't the ones we expect. They're the ones that come when we think we've already won. Jake took a deep breath and typed out his response. His fingers trembled as he hit send. Asterisk-y appreciate the opportunity, but this isn't the right path for me asterisk. The moment the message disappeared from his screen, a weight lifted from his chest, but a new kind of tension settled in. He had made his choice, but now came the consequences. The replies came in quickly. Some were understanding, but most weren't. Asterisk, are you crazy? You're throwing away your future asterisk asterisk. You'll regret this asterisk asterisk. You'll never get another chance like this asterisk. The word stung, but Jake held his ground. He had spent years letting others decide his worth. That ended today. But just as he started feeling certain about his decision, life threw him one final test. A few days later, he got a call from his boss. It wasn't a normal check-in. There was something off about the tone. "Jake, we need to talk," his boss said, voice firm but unreadable. When Jake walked into the office the next morning, he could feel it in the air. Something had shifted. The higher-ups had heard about his decision to turn down the big project. Word had spread fast. It wasn't just his friends who thought he had made a mistake. His company did too. "We need people who are ambitious, who are willing to take risks," his boss said, looking at him with careful disappointment. "Are you sure this is the right place for you?" Jake felt his stomach twist. He knew what was happening. They weren't firing him outright, but they were making it clear he wasn't seen the same way anymore. He wasn't the golden employee, the rising star. He was replaceable. For a split second, panic surged through him. Had he really messed up? Had he let go of something good just to chase some vague idea of personal growth? What if everyone else was right? But then another thought pushed through the noise. If staying meant sacrificing himself again, was it really worth it? He met his boss's gaze, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to prove himself. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He was chasing something real. "You're right," Jake said slowly. "Maybe this isn't the right place for me." His boss blinked, taken aback. The answer wasn't what they expected. Neither was what Jake did next. He walked out. Not just from the meeting, not just from the job. He walked out of the life he had built for all the wrong reasons. For the first time in years, he had no plan, no next step, no perfect answer. But for the first time in years, he asterisk wasn't afraid asterisk. He didn't know exactly what his future looked like. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to spend another second living for anyone but himself. And just when he thought the story had reached its end, life gave him one last surprise. As he was packing up his desk, his phone buzzed. A message. It wasn't from his boss. It wasn't from his friends. It was from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who had once known him before he lost himself. "Asterisk saw what you did. Proud of you. Let's talk. I think I have something you'll want to hear." Asterisk. Jake stared at the screen, heart pounding. Maybe walking away wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. Jake sat there for a moment, staring at the message on his phone. His heart was still racing from everything that had just happened. He had walked away from his job, from the life he thought he was supposed to live. And now, out of nowhere, someone from his past had reached out. It felt too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. He hesitated before replying. Asterisk, what if this was just another distraction? Another thing that pulled him away from what he was trying to build asterisk, but deep down, something told him this was different. So he took a breath and typed back. Asterisk, let's talk. Asterisk. The next day, he met up with the person behind the message, Liam. They had been close once, back in high school, before life pulled them in different directions. Liam had always been different from the others. He never cared about status or impressing people. He just followed what felt right, and somehow that had led him to a life that actually made sense. Jake hadn't seen him in years, but as soon as they sat down, it felt like no time had passed. I saw what you did, Liam said, leaning back in his chair. That takes guts. Jake let out a dry laugh. It takes something. I don't know if it's guts or just complete insanity. Liam grinned. Maybe both. He took a sip of his coffee before leaning forward. But I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And I think I might have something for you. Jake frowned. What do you mean? Liam pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. On the screen was a project, something completely different from the corporate world Jake had just walked away from. It wasn't about status or power. It was about creating something meaningful. We've been working on this for a while, Liam explained. It's not flashy. It's not going to make anyone rich overnight. But at *Matters*, we're building something real. And I think you'd be a perfect fit. Jake stared at the screen. It wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't what his past self would have considered successful. But as he read through the details, something inside him clicked. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was chasing something just to prove himself. He felt like he was aligning with something real. It wasn't going to be easy. He had no guarantees, no roadmap, no safety net. Because he had finally learned the most important lesson. When you stop living for others, you start living for yourself. Over the next few months, Jake threw himself into the project. He wasn't chasing titles or validation anymore. He was building something with people who actually cared, people who weren't caught up in the game of appearances. And as he worked, something changed. The restless feeling he had carried for years, the constant anxiety of never being enough, started to fade. He no longer felt the need to compare himself to others. He no longer needed to prove anything. He was simply doing creating, learning, growing. And then one day, he woke up and realized something incredible. He was happy. Not in the way he used to chase happiness, through achievements or validation. This was different. This was a quiet, steady kind of happiness. The kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're supposed to be. One evening, as he sat on his balcony watching the sunset, he thought back to the version of himself from a year ago, the one who was trapped in a life that didn't feel like his own. He wished he could tell that version of himself something. You don't have to be who the world expects you to be. You just have to be real. Be honest. Be you. And everything else will fall into place. But maybe he didn't need to tell his past self that. Maybe, deep down, he had always known. He had just needed the courage to listen. And now, finally, he had. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges, still be doubts, still be moments of uncertainty. But Jake wasn't afraid of that anymore. Because now he knew that as long as he stayed true to himself, he would always find his way. And that was the real secret power of focusing on yourself.